All right, it's time for that moment when. From me to you, season one review. Yeah, so I initially was not going to do this episode this early, but I think today's going to be, a double episode day. Obviously, it is Thursday, so I'm going to do my Nintendo Switch 2 reveal day, or like 4 weeks out kind of episode. But I also wanted to do this one because I tend to, especially with shows like this, I tend to forget a lot of stuff pretty quickly soon after. And I only just started episode one of the next season, which so far only has stuff from the last season. So season one, I wanted to discuss. And I don't, I assume it's a Netflix original. I don't know, but like the way they have it broken up is I think it was like 24 or 25 episodes in season one, and then I think 12 and 12. Um, but regardless, I wanted to touch on season one specifically. So these like first 24, 25 episodes of the show. Obviously, a lot of these kinds of shows that I end up watching, it's just more of, oh, this is something to have on. It's very, more basic. This is probably the most basic kind of anime I've seen in a while. Ranma was very kind of crackhead in a lot of ways, and it was very reminiscent of a very different time. This is as well in a very, very interesting degree. Quintuple quintuplets is bad. And yeah, this I actually is my favorite of the three thus far. I would say in terms of up until probably the original Christmas episode, I had no issues with the show whatsoever. And maybe that can be attributed to it just kind of staying in its confines well or something, but the show really didn't make me very upset at all. Or very least very like there a lot of times there's always one plot line or something that I go, oh, this is stupid, but I feel like this is a show where pretty much every character in the present moment, minus one, maybe two, are like pretty much every character is likable. Excuse me, and like makes sense from kind of their direction standpoint. We have the protagonist who is Kuro Numa. I'm gonna be really bad with the names. And we obviously have Kazehaya here, and obviously like it's very clear that they have more broad. They're very like broad appeal characters, and there's not supposed to have too much to them, but they still have enough kind of traits to make them still enjoyable and not too boring, in my opinion. Like I was really surprised because I was like, oh, very clearly this is male character romantic interest who is very pop. It's just a popular guy, and it's like, okay, is that enough to make him interesting? Actually, yeah, they do have moments in the show where he actually does things that are really kind of significant, and they do paint him in specific ways. And it doesn't mean that he's, perceived negatively at all, but more that he actually gets to have some amount of a personality, which is really interesting. And it is more of him being kind of a nice guy, but even that like gets broken a lot, like especially later towards the end of the season, which I actually don't think is a bad thing. I think it's interesting. Um, I think it's funny that they also make it very clear that they both have feelings, or at the very least, they make it more clear that he has feelings for her very early on. Like as much as I think episode one, it's kind of clear before she kind of realizes, and you clearly have it where they have the dynamic, and the will they won't they aspect doesn't upset me much. I think in a lot of other shows it does because it feels like more natural progression, and therefore it's just not upsetting at all to me. Like I generally don't mind it at all. I will say that I think the my biggest concern with the show moving forward is who and what they center on, especially with seeing that Kurumi is there. And I'm gonna be honest, uh, one of my favorite characters from the show. I think Kurumi, at least in regards to how she interacts with Koronuma, is very well done. It's not that it's just, oh, she's like an antagonist because they needed an antagonist. Like, because like going into, mid, even like the early part of when she starts appearing, I'm like, oh, they clearly are like, they seem to be making her out initial, like in before she really starts interacting with Koronuma. They're like, oh, she seems to be like a positive character, and but it's like we don't really know. But she's very clearly just misguided by a past and is just kind of jaded and agitating, but yet kind of doesn't like is a excellent foil to Koronuma. Like they function on very different ways, and I actually really like it because it means that she gets to be this kind of jaded mess who's interacting with someone who doesn't really understand kind of their dynamic at all. And I actually think it creates some really funny moments, but also just some really interesting kind of character writing. It just is not. It's not like the most amazing thing ever, but I was very taken aback by how much I enjoyed their interactions, especially once Kurumi ends up being more honest about things. It's a very I think it's great, honestly. It was one of the parts of the show where I was like, oh, I want to keep seeing them interact. I'm a little scared that they're gonna like try to redeem her or do all these things. That's not something I want. I don't like think it's inherently a bad thing to do that, but like I think it's like where they leave her and like she can kind of get better on her own, uh, or like and still kind of be impacted in this way is just more interesting. I don't want them to like just make her a protagonist essentially. That's my fear. Um, but still, I think she's pretty cool. And I don't know. I really commend her character work. Like genuinely really well done. Um, there are also like there's Yano and Jizu, I think. And they're like the two friend characters. They're pretty entertaining. Um, there's I don't know, like obviously Yano doesn't get too much development, but she also is just a very good kind of. She gets put as a mature character, but she's not really that mature. She can be very also like jaded as well in a lot of ways, and like that also is really interesting. You have Chizu who is more like tomboyish, and they're like, oh, you know, her whole thing with the Ryu's brother and that whole dynamic Ryu is actually pretty interesting. I don't think it's as good as the Kurumi the Kurumi part or Kurumi. See, I'm gonna be messing up the names a lot. The Kurumi part of the show, I think, is the best part of the show. I think it's just like the that and like the early parts where they're just building up, and I think after that, it's not as interesting. And it's also a lot easier to hate Ryu in that kind of era than it is in any other part. But they very clearly like at the same time once you kind of understand like kind of more of the dynamic with the brother and whatnot, then it's like it makes more sense. Like his perspective, he definitely could be, wording things better. But I don't know. It's a very like it's very I'm very like mixed on it, but it's still like again trending positive, and I still was enjoying the show at those points, but it definitely was where I was like teetering on it. The only part I remember really not liking initially was the whole Christmas thing, and then the dad character being the most annoying character in the show at that point. I was like, oh, I actually really don't like him. And they did pseudo redeem him by being like, oh, you got her a phone. But it still was like, I don't know. It's hard to not feel like what he was doing was at least somewhat manipulative, but it was hard to tell through the lens that they were pushing. Um, and you just, I mean, like, just seeing the gift in the room and just taking it. Like, I don't know. I don't like the dad character. I think that's the only character I genuinely don't like in the show, which is a lot. That, like, one singular character to not like in a sea of characters that I genuinely and generally really do like. Joe is the only one where I'm like, Joe gives off gay character and then just becomes desperate straight character, which is funny, but also is really random. Like, there's a lot of little individual things that are definitely like I take issue with to some degree, but it's like not a bad thing. Um, and obviously the show, in a lot of ways, it's like, oh, it's these hyper cliches and it's all this stuff about learning love and whatever. But at the same time, it makes sense to have it in this context where you have this extremely socially ostracized character getting into that point. And I think at that point, it makes more sense. Like, I think it makes more sense than all this other stuff where, yeah, the character just doesn't know how to deal with the feelings kind of building up and whatever all that stuff because it is a new thing. And obviously, Kurumi exploits that, and there's all that stuff. Like, those are things I actually think are well done in the show. I think that those are not issues. I could see, I don't know reviews around this show at all. I like don't know how it's received, but like the fact that it's a Netflix show with more than one season doesn't really tell me anything. Anyway, I do think that part's all good. In terms of the visuals, I obviously like it's not animated like the best animated, and it's not like there are a lot of points where it is just still frames, and they do use flashback kind of sequence things that do annoy me a bit, but it is not the most agitating thing in the world. It's not that bad, and in fact, I actually like how it functions stylistically with how it looks visually. Like, I actually really like the visual aesthetic. Yes, it's simple, but it is different than a lot of the more modern anime, and I think that having it be this distinct is nice. It makes it feel older in conjunction with the world being like, where they're using flip phones and stuff. Like, those two things combined make it just feel very comforting and like an older anime while still having kind of these benefits of a more modern production, if that makes sense. Um, the songs are generally good, except for I really don't like the closing song at all, and I really don't like it at that like that like season finale. I really don't like that one, but the intro song is actually great in my opinion. I really like that one, and just the whole intro sequence. It's not even like an amazing thing. It's just very nice, which I think this show just is very nice so far. It definitely has like darker tone things, but like I don't know. Yeah, every character so far I've enjoyed. My worries are they will make Yano and Pin have a romance because please don't. They're like I understand that Yano was seeing an older guy and there was a whole thing, but like don't do that again. Don't do that. No, I don't know. I'm not a fan of that. Um, and I don't know. Yeah, there's that. There's kind of Kurumi getting over centered. I also weird thing. I don't want them to make Kazehaya the protagonist out of nowhere. He's just simply not as interesting. He's definitely can be made to be interesting, but I like how they do that in little chunks through interactions versus trying to center the whole show on him. I think that would be a negative. And I think just most of all, I don't want them to suddenly have all the arcs be bad because a big thing with a lot of shows is it's hard for them to make good arcs after the first few. And the fact that the first, like the Kurumi arc, was so much better than the Ryu and Chizu arc does make me a little worried. I'm a little worried. So we'll see how that plotline goes. Anyway, that moment when I got to record the other episode already.